Denver Broncos head coach Sean Payton believes that the offensive line is one of the top needs the Broncos have to address if Russell Wilson is going to perform better here in 2023. We share our thoughts on that and more from the South Stands to the end zone on today's brand new episode, Locked on Broncos.
You are Locked on Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast. Part of the Locked on Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What's up, Broncos country? Welcome into a brand new episode of Locked on Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast, part of the Locked on Podcast Network, your team every day. Thank you so much to everybody in Broncos country for tuning in, making Locked on Broncos your first listen of the day every single day, free and available everywhere you get your podcast in audio format, or whether you watch on YouTube. We're grateful for you. Thank you so much. I'm your host, as always, Cody Roark, Broncos reporter for Mile High Sports, joined alongside, as always, by my co-host and my good friend, Sayre Bedinger, site expert, predominantlyorange.com. Sayre, Radio Row Week continues here for me in beautiful Phoenix, while Broncos are kind of being quiet on some moves, but there is always talk. There's always speculation. And Sean Payton, even though he's here right now in Phoenix, and we saw him yesterday, he is still working as the next Broncos head coach.
He is, Cody, and he's still addressing questions. I know the 50-minute press conference is over, but still questions to be asked, still answers to be given. Still everybody's eager to find his perspective more and more on this team, right? Because, well, we've heard some controversial reports, right? Like his former colleague or current and soon-to-be former colleague, Terry Bradshaw at Fox, talking about the Russell Wilson thing and his opinions on Russell Wilson, which are a little eyebrow-raising for those who don't know. Sounds like Terry was kind of saying that Sean took the job in spite of Russell Wilson, when in fact I think we're hearing a lot of the opposite, Cody. Sounds like he put together a really strong plan for how to get things back on track for Russell Wilson, and he spoke specifically to our good friends at KOA about that and about what the Broncos need and what he noticed watching last year's team. He said, obviously, there's injuries at the outside positions, wide receiver. You had the injury to Javonte Williams, a very talented running back. But he made a specific comment at the end of this clip that they shared on Twitter that I want to just quote him. Cody, he said, "How do we bring him," meaning Russell Wilson, off of the high dive and bring him down to the 3-foot diving board with the running game and play action? He said, "I think we've got to improve in some areas. I think we've got to improve on the offensive line. That's clear when you watch the tape." So I think him saying that, it takes off any sort of, okay, do they perceive this the same way? I know there was a lot of arguments between the fan base last year of, well, it's not the offensive line fault, it's Russell Wilson's fault, and vice versa. So, Cody, I think Sean Payton has kind of laid it out here pretty clearly for us what the Broncos' top need this offseason is.
You know, one thing that stands out to me about the offensive line and about, Russell Wilson is just knowing some of the things that I know now that I was told by players after the season versus during. And the reality is they just didn't have a coach. Like Butch Berry didn't do a very great job of teaching them how to do certain things, right? Like he would just say, hey, this is, do this, but he wouldn't show them how. He wouldn't explain like why it's important they do this way. And I also think that has a lot to do with maybe what was going on the offensive line. We all know the offense had no identity last season. So when you don't have a clear-cut identity and you're just like, oh, hey, we're just going to be pass protection on this one. We're going to run block on this one. But there was no scheme-based resolutions, right, that I think put the offensive line in a fair advantage. And not to mention, we talk about all the injuries on the offensive line. We felt like week one, right? Quinn Miners, fully healthy. He's like, okay, hey, the Broncos run game's going here with Javonte. Quinn goes out with a hamstring injury, misses a lot of time. Then you have to shuffle guys around on the offensive line. You get Billy Turner back later on in the year, week 6 of, the NFL season. And then you just have a turnstile of different guys getting hurt and rotating in and out of the offensive line, having different units on a week-to-week basis. That definitely impacts it. But I also know this, knowing Sean Payton and knowing that he's bringing in, obviously, Zach Strife as his offensive line coach, he is going to implement a scheme that makes sense. And what he's also going to do, and he also made mention of this as well, they're going to take a look at everything, the players that they know, and they're going to figure out how can we build a scheme that, supports what they do well. And I imagine this offseason, I'm sure free agency, I imagine offensive line is probably going to be one of their top priorities to address, adding some depth. And we'll see what they decide to do from there. But I do agree with Peyton. It's not just on the offensive line. We all know, I think from our position, offensive line is a huge need, specifically at right tackle. You need to have a contingency plan at left tackle in case Garrett Bowles, like I said, coming off of a severely broken leg, that's going to take some time as well. And what happens if he runs into soreness? What happens if he just runs into, stuff where you're going to have to provide injury management to him? So many questions you have to account for outside of just who's your starters on the offensive line.
Well, and I think we're seeing Sean Payton and the Broncos kind of put their money where their mouth is, so to speak. There, like you mentioned, you bring in the new offensive line coach, Zach Strife from the New Orleans Saints, and you get him, and that's the first big assistant that he's brought in that we know of, right? So certainly you're putting your money where your mouth is there and saying, hey, we know that the offensive line needs to be addressed. And more than anything, Cody, I think it's not just it's all encompassing, right? People want to say, well, it's the talent level of the guys you got out there. You don't have enough talent out there, or you're not investing enough in free agency, or you're not putting your assets in the right place. Doing all that. I think talent development, player development is the biggest key to this whole thing. And hopefully this hire, that offensive line coach hire, we were hopeful it could be maybe Mike Munchak, maybe Dan Rushar. The biggest thing to me, and I think or hopefully for everyone else here, is player development there. Like you said, Butch Berry kind of just asking guys to go out there, hey, here's what we're doing, go out and do it, instead of really teaching the why behind the what, right? That's a big leadership concept. Why behind the what. Get your players to understand the why, right? Get your employees. I think that this is going to be the key thing, getting that player development, having guys ready, whether it was, we talked about this with the New Orleans Saints, whether it was late round picks or undrafted guys, whether it was first round picks and highly touted guys, didn't matter. They had all different types. Teron Armstead, not necessarily a first round pick, but became a Pro Bowl player. Guys like Jari Evans, guys like, now you have Cesar Ruiz and Andrews Pete. Those are high draft picks. They have all different guys out there. It's how you maximize those players with your coaching, the player development aspect. That is the biggest key, I think, in terms of building this offensive line.
Well, and even Strief too, he's kind of a developmental guy. He came in 2006. He was drafted by the Saints when Sean Payton was there. He was a lifer. He was a lifer with the New Orleans Saints organization, and he was a team captain. So he developed, obviously, over the years to be one of the most trustworthy guys that Sean Payton has ever worked with on the offensive line. So now he's getting his feet into the coaching room. We'll have you updated here on Locked On Broncos throughout the week as we know more staff changes, hiring changes, whatever you may have. You get that here on Locked On Broncos. But on today's episode of the show, Michael Vick suggests that Sean Payton could be bringing in competition for Russell Wilson. Is there any truth to this? Does it make sense? We'll dive into that on today's episode, Locked On Broncos. This episode of the show is brought to you by our friends over at LinkedIn. And as a small business owner or hiring manager, you know that success in 2023 all depends on the team members you surround yourself with. That's why you have to check out LinkedIn Jobs. With LinkedIn Jobs, you can hire qualified candidates more efficiently by matching open roles with people who have the skills, the values, and experiences to help you achieve your goals. LinkedIn Jobs helps you quickly attract qualified candidates to your open jobs with targeting tools. They go beyond resume data by using insights from your job post, your company, and their 875 million member profiles to put your post in front of the most qualified candidates. Identify the most qualified candidates on LinkedIn Jobs and connect with them fast and for free. LinkedIn Jobs makes it easy to screen and rate applicants based on your job qualifications, all on one platform. It's why small businesses rate LinkedIn Jobs #1 in delivering quality hires versus leading competitors. LinkedIn Jobs helps you find the qualified candidates you want to talk to faster. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedonnfl. That's linkedin.com/lockedonnfl to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. As we continue on today's episode, Locked On Broncos, just want to say thank you so much to everybody in Broncos country for tuning in, making Locked On Broncos your first listen of the day every single day. If you don't do so, you're missing out because you can have a morning cup of coffee with Sayre and I as we break down all the latest news in Dove Valley every single day, all year long, because for the true fan, there is never an off season. Sayre, my friend, with the Fox media stuff that was going on this week at Radio Row, Michael Vick, who's obviously a correspondent and a panelist over there, It's a very interesting things to say about Russell Wilson, Sean Payton, the quarterback dynamic. I mean, even to the point where he even said, he says, I expect Coach Payton to bring in some competition and push Russell Wilson a little bit. Do we buy this, considering the fact that Russ has got this massive contract and a lot of duration on it? Are we buying this? Is Sean Payton really going to look to bring somebody in to push Russell Wilson?
Well, Cody, my first question is going to be, was he kind of winding up that left shoulder there? Was he winding up that arm, because I know I've seen him on the old Destroying YouTube page throwing some passes. No, I think absolutely we buy this. Why? Because we've talked about this. The Broncos need a better contingency at the QB position in 2023. And we've talked about that before. We talked about it kind of when Russ was really struggling bad, but I think that same truth applies now, even with a stronger finish to the season than we saw for the majority of 2022. Even if Russ is fully healthy, even if we say this new coaching staff is bought in fully to his abilities, here's something that I really want to point out. Sean Payton, in his coaching career, has made a number of quarterbacks a lot of money, namely, obviously, Drew Brees, who I believe his career earnings was over like 250 some million in terms of cash paid out by the Saints. That's obviously the biggest one. Then you have Teddy Bridgewater, who came in. The Saints, remember, they traded for him after he signed with the New York Jets in free agency. The Saints trade for him when he was coming off that gruesome leg injury. He ends up playing 5 games for them, starting 5 games, winning all 5, and parlaying that into a 3-year, $63 million deal with the Panthers. You look at Jameis Winston, plays 7 games for Sean Payton, on pace for over 50 touchdowns before he tore his ACL. He gets a 2-year, $28 million deal. Taysom Hill made over $40 million in cash from the Saints in his career. What I'm saying is this: quarterbacks that need to rehab their value are going to want to come and play for Sean Payton, or even ride his bench and get preseason reps with him as their coach calling the plays, because they got to know, their agents got to know, Sean Payton is going to make you money. So if you're a former high draft pick, like a Jameis Winston, who maybe he'll be a cap casualty of the Saints this offseason, would love to see him in Denver. Baker Mayfield, former number 1 pick. Sam Darnold, former number 3 pick. Cody, there's going to be a lot of guys in this free agency period that I think makes sense in terms of being these guys to push Russ. It's not a quarterback competition. It's somebody to come behind him and push as a talented player, instead of somebody who you just sign, hey, this guy's the backup. That's his life in the NFL, essentially. No, this guy wants to start eventually again, and he's going to push to play as much as possible, if possible.
Well, I also think Denver does have to be smarter, because going into, like, at some point during next season, Russell Wilson will turn 35 years old, right? You have to find a way, even though you have this contract, you have to find a way, whether that's through, as you mentioned, free agency, or whether it's through the NFL draft, not this year, but I'm speaking more so specifically after next season. You have to look at maybe contingency plans beyond that, right? And Sean Payton, I think in the optics of Denver taking a quarterback and developing under Sean Payton during his tenure as the head coach, I think it's very viable. And it's not like the writing's on the wall against Russell Wilson, because here's the deal, and I'm glad that you pointed it out. All those quarterbacks that you mentioned played significantly better under Sean Payton. And it's because he built the system and the scheme around things that they did, not only what they did well, but what the receivers do well, what the running back does well, what their offensive line does. But I've also noticed, too, the foundation for them, you and I talked about in the last segment. Everything is really predicated and set up off of the offensive line and having stout guys there. The offensive line is the foundation for the entire offense in which Sean Payton runs. I'm very excited to see what he decides to do, but I wouldn't be opposed to seeing a guy like Jameis Winston, Baker Mayfield in Denver as a backup. I mean, you look at that, I think, and you kind of relish at the opportunity. Okay, you may not start right now, but you may actually be in line to take over one day, whether you're, a veteran guy who's riding the bench, or if you're a young guy that, the team drafts and develops. I do think that you have to start looking ahead, not to replace Russell Wilson. I don't mean that, because you invested in him. You have this contract. You have to at least give him 2023 to see if he can play better, especially with Sean Payton. And if he does, you know what? It gives you some leeway, gives you some breathing room. And then if he doesn't, now you can start to plan. And I think the Broncos would start to plan as well, saying, okay, hey, 2 years in a row, he has not played up to standard. We need to figure out what our contingency plan is. We already know the Broncos have the richest owner in all of pro football and all of American sports, by the way. And I do think that they will look at options if necessary, but the standard has to change. And I think that Sean Payton, has come in early on and he's kind of put his foot down saying that we're going to do things this way. And he did mention it. It's not for everyone.
Right. And you're exactly right, Cody. And people can't get this twisted, right? We're not saying, well, Sam Darnold should come in and compete with Russell Wilson for the starting. No, we're not saying that. We're not saying the Broncos need to move on from Russ. We're not saying they're going to do that. None of that. So don't get it twisted here. We're talking about options and QBs in the NFL as much as anything, their currency, right? So you want to get quarterbacks in the building that can provide value to your team, to other
Look at the
teams.
49ers.
Like the 49ers, look at them. I mean, and even in the situation that they're in, you still got to be thinking to yourself, man, they got 2 or 3 guys that can legitimately start in big games in the NFL right now, which is crazy to think about. But that's why you consistently throw darts at this board, whether it's free agency, whether it's the NFL draft. If you have the right QB developer in place as the head coach, as offensive coordinator, QB's coach, whatever the case may be, if you have the right person in place, you put guys in that system to be successful. And I think that's where these reclamation projects kind of come about. It's why, the idea of a Sam Darnold in Denver or Baker Mayfield in Denver has a ton of legitimacy right now because, like you said, Cody, we're not planning on moving on from Russ, but you talk about next year. What about next year? What if Russell is bad in 2023? You signed Baker Mayfield to a 2-year deal in this offseason. All of a sudden now you can move on from Russell Wilson with a financially responsible option to be a bridge player if you go ahead and try to draft somebody in 2024. You have to plan with one eye on the future, and you can't just consider these guys a lost cause. Remember, Jameis Winston, he threw 30 interceptions in 2019 for the Bucks. Comes back and, like I said, on pace for 50 touchdowns with the lowest interception percentage of his career, by the way, in that one season with the Saints. So you can't look at these guys as a lost cause or a sunk cost or a failure as an NFL player. Sam Darnold's 25 years old, believe it or not. Baker Mayfield is 26, 27 years old. These guys are absolutely worth investing in. And I know people are already telling me in my mentions, no, all the money has to go to the O-line. Well, yes, a lot of it needs to go to the O-line, but you need a contingency plan at quarterback. And thankfully, for the Broncos' sake, there's actually quite a few available this offseason.
I even think we can take a look at how those quarterbacks that you mentioned, right? Once Sean Payton stepped away, I mean, how did they look? Like, quarterback position for the Saints this year was not ideal. Like Jameis, he was banged up, but he also took a step back to the point he couldn't even get back on the field and upend Andy Dalton. That to me, I think, was very puzzling. But it just goes to show that, Peyton does do things that put quarterbacks in good positions. You also have to have a contingency plan, not just on the eye on the future, but also in the event that Russell Wilson gets hurt, right? Because, well, what did we see last year? Russ missed a couple of games last year due to injuries. You have to have solidified options behind him. And I think you have to have more than one quarterback on the roster, right? Like I said, it can't just be like Russell Wilson, Brett Rippon. I think you have to have Russell Wilson, Brett Rippon. Hopefully they bring him back because he's a restricted free agent. But then you also bring in another guy as well. The NFL has to change the quarterback rules, in my opinion. That's a topic for another day here on Locked On Broncos. But one thing is for certain, Broncos country, we are eager for your thoughts on this subject matter. Should the Broncos look to bring in somebody at the quarterback behind Russell Wilson this offseason to push him a little bit or to also have contingency plans on the future? Let us know in the YouTube comment section. If you're watching, or tweet us on Twitter at Cody Roark NFL, at Sayre Bedinger, at Locked On Broncos. One of the things you're going to get on today's episode of the show, what are the latest rumblings surrounding the coaching staff? The Broncos have their eye on a potential offensive coordinator. Who is that? And on top of that, a former Broncos staff member heads over to Carolina with Ejiro Evero. You get that on today's episode, Locked On Broncos. This episode of the show is brought to you by our friends at FanDuel Sportsbook. This year, the only app you'll need at your Super Bowl party is FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. And we're really excited about our new sports betting partner for Locked On because they are the #1 sportsbook in America, FanDuel. And if you're new to FanDuel, that's even better. They have so many great features that make betting on sports fun and easy. Download FanDuel now so you can bet Super Bowl 57 with a no-sweat first bet, and you'll get up to $3,000 back in bonus bets if your first bet doesn't win. FanDuel lets you bet on everything from the money line to point spreads to who will score a touchdown in Super Bowl 57. The FanDuel Sportsbook app is safe, it's secure, and it's super easy to use. And best of all, you get paid your winnings instantly. So join FanDuel today at FanDuel.com/LockedOn to claim your no-sweat first bet on Super Bowl 57. That's FanDuel.com/LockedOn. Make every moment more with FanDuel, official sportsbook partner of the NFL. As Sean Payton puts in his final week with the Fox broadcast crew ahead of Super Bowl 57, he's still working behind the scenes quietly on assembling a coaching staff. And Sayre, he's got his eyes on an offensive coordinator option that has some familiarity with what he wants to do, but also more importantly, it may not be like the big splashy name that everybody in Broncos country is hoping for.
Right, Cody, and that name is Ronald Curry. And for those of you who grew up in the late 90s, early 2000s, loving and watching football, you might remember Ronald Curry as a quarterback in North Carolina who turned out to be actually a very good wide receiver for the Oakland Raiders for 7 years. Cody, I remember him playing for the Raiders. I didn't know that his NFL career as a player was 7 years long because he was kind of like the Kendall Hinton of the time. Obviously he ended up having a very long and successful career as a receiver. We'll see what the future holds for Kendall Hinton. But now, most recently, we've seen him with the New Orleans Saints as quarterbacks coach. And even more recently than that, he was at the Senior Bowl for anybody who watched practices and things like that. He was one of the offensive coordinators out there. And I love, by the way, that Jim Nagy and the Senior Bowl, they're doing that, giving these position coaches and other assistants an opportunity to show what they can do in bigger roles. I think that's a tremendous, tremendous idea, and it's beneficial for everyone. And hey, maybe Ronald Curry goes from being an offensive coordinator at the Senior Bowl to now being the offensive coordinator of the Broncos. And we know, Cody, that's going to be mostly a title because Sean Payton is going to call the plays. But at the same time, it gives you a potential up-and-coming candidate there to kind of consider for, maybe he's a future head coach somewhere. Maybe he's really, really strong developing in the QB area. Whatever the case may be, he would be a fascinating fit for the Denver Broncos.
Well, some other coaching candidates as well, right? Tight end coach. We all know Jake Moreland. We talked about it yesterday on the show. Obviously, the Broncos parted ways with him, but they have interest in Declan Doyle as their next potential tight end coach there. So I wonder how that'll be for guys like Greg Dulcich, Albert Okwuegbunam. How does it impact guys like E.T., Eric Saubert, Andrew Beck in free agency? There's all these things, but you can definitely tell, like when it comes to the offensive side of the ball, there are a lot of guys that Sean Payton wants that Denver can't have because then they'd have to request permission. It would be considered a lateral move for some guys. So he's taking guys that he trusts that, essentially for them, it's promotions. And I think that's a good strategy. But, as a coach, you bring in the people that you trust, that can run things the way that you want, right? It's not just like hiring your friends. It's hiring who will teach the things that you need to be taught, from a playing standpoint, from a schematic standpoint. That's always crucial when you assemble your staff. And as you mentioned, Sean Payton is going to be in complete control. But on Tuesday, during the whole Fox thing, right, it was all set up. Not sure when it happened, but Sean Payton did interview Sean Desai for the team's defensive coordinator job. As the time that we're recording this podcast, and it may upload, obviously, audio-wise, YouTube-wise, different times, there is no word on if Desai will be the DC or not. There's been no official announcement, and knowing our luck, the moment we're done recording this, it's probably going to come out at some point. So if that's the case, just a disclaimer, that always happens to us. Outside of that, you look at some other moves, right? We talk about linebacker coach Peter Hansen getting, he was released by the Broncos. Didn't take him long to go to a Giro Evero staff in Carolina. Now, I'll tell you this, Sayre, yesterday I ran into Alex Singleton here in Los Angeles at Radio Row. I'm going to sit down on Thursday with Patrick Surtain. I'm very excited about that. But I ran into Alex Singleton, and I just, he's here on behalf representing the Special Olympics and whatnot. It's a cause that's very important to him. And I just said, hey, man, regardless, he's like, I don't know how free agency is going to go, but it was fun covering you this season. And he expressed that he wants to come back to Denver. So you know what? Like, music to my ears. We all want to hear that. I know they sat down with their good friends over at DNVR. He said the same exact thing to them. He wants to play another year here. He and Josie Jewell are super, super close. And he's like, yeah, man, I'm excited to see what it's like. He even asked me what the press conference was like with Sean Payton. I said, hey, it's like different vibe. It's a different vibe, like business up front, and we'll see how things go. And he's the type of guy I think is excited for it, man. But like I said, there's various Broncos players that are out here in Phoenix, and there's some excitement. There's some excitement around Sean Payton, and I definitely felt like we should highlight that.
No doubt. And I love that you brought up Singleton too, because I was mentioning, as Carolina fans probably wondering about their new assistant coaches coming in. I just made sure to make a comment because I felt like Peter Hansen, Alex Singleton, Jonas Griffith, Josie Jewell. I feel like that position group deserves its flowers, doesn't it, Cody? Just because I know
Yeah.
we had talked about this going into last season, felt like that was maybe the worst position group on the team in terms of looking at everything on paper. Turned out to be maybe the best, right? Alex Singleton and Josie Jewell, kind of Bash brothers out there. Jonas Griffith, he played through injury early on, obviously landed on IR late, but still believing very much so in his potential. Athletic freak, great size. So I think Peter Hansen, a great addition to the Carolina Panthers, along with his Giro Evero over there. And like you said, hopefully Alex Singleton is back. I know that we kind of talked about this before, maybe worrying a little bit. Well, who's Giro Evero maybe going to steal from this Broncos roster to take with him player-wise? And Singleton is one of their most prominent free agents. But I think that factor there that you mentioned, the friendship with Josie Jewell, I think that plays heavily and weighs heavily on his potential future. Maybe even, maybe a little hometown discount, Cody. I don't know if you really want to call it that. He'll get a fair offer, I think, but certainly may be willing to help the team out to stick around with the Broncos in a great situation for him.
I think the Broncos will definitely pay him more than he made last year because he exceeded, like he earned, I think, a bigger payday for how he played last year. I mean, the leading tackler. I mean, he didn't even start at the first part of the season. He came in, he's the leading tackler, and he didn't even lead the team in special teams tackles. He was behind PJ Locke by one tackle. So the fact that he just came in and just like was everywhere, all over where the football was, there he was there. And I know that a lot of people say, oh, the Broncos linebackers can't cover. They're not supposed to cover wide receivers and tight ends. That's not the thing. To cover running backs out of the backfield. Then they play zone in the middle hook, folks. That's it. So I'm glad that, we were able to see him. He's such a nice dude, man. And it was great seeing him in Radio Row and see Emmanuel Sanders on Thursday as well. Ask him about Sean Payton and also Patrick Surtain. Going to sit down with him, man, and talk about the prospects like for him, Pro Bowl, All-Pro in his second year. He's got a lot of accolades to be proud of there, but also his thoughts on Sean Payton. And we can't wait to share it here on Locked On Broncos, my friend. But Broncos country, thank you so much for tuning in to today's episode of the show. You can get this podcast free and available everywhere you get your podcast in audio format, or whether you watch on YouTube. Sayre and I will be back tomorrow with more Broncos news, content coverage, and more here on Locked On Broncos.